So thank you all for joining us today. It is really a pleasure of mine to be here and to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Vanessa Newby. I'm just going to read a short bio and then we'll get started, and then I'm happy to moderate the discussion and questions that come up afterwards. So Vanessa Newby is an assistant professor at Leiden University and president of Women in International Security Netherlands, based in The Hague. Her research interests include gender and security, peacekeeping, humanitarian aid and disaster response, and the international relations of the Middle East. She's conducted research on the Middle East for over 12 years and is an Arabic speaker, and she's the author of Peacekeeping in South Lebanon, Credibility and Local Cooperation, which was published with Syracuse University Press a few years ago in 2018, and has published in several international peer-reviewed journals, such as the Global Studies Quarterly, European Journal of International Security, the Australian Journal of International Affairs, Third World Quarterly, Contemporary Politics and International Peacekeeping. So her lecture is entitled Unravelling the Mysteries, Embracing the Particular and the General in Middle East Research, and it draws from work on a recent book chapter on the rise of area studies and international relations and the mutual disdain that has characterized their interactions, which I'm excited to learn more about. So please help me welcome Vanessa Newby. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. I think, I don't know, because I'm also, if I do that, I'm going to hide the webcams from my view, if that's all right, while I'm talking. Is that okay? And then for the discussion. So if I do this, I'm not sure if what that does to everyone else's view. Is that okay, Sarlene? Okay.
It's totally okay. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Sorry.
Showing my thumb and then realizing you can't see me. Sorry.
No, that's fine. Sorry. It helps me concentrate more. I find the screens a little bit, sometimes I get distracted looking at the faces. So, okay. So thank you very much for that kind introduction. And essentially, oh, hang on. I need to have my speech on the other side so I can switch to the next slide. As you've already said, today I'm going to discuss in very broad terms the debates between area studies and IR scholarship that have shaped resentments between the disciplines since the Second World War. In addition, I'll discuss briefly the methodological issues that contribute to the clash of cultures between area studies research and IR research. As you've already kindly said, this talk is part of a broader book chapter entitled Embracing the Particular Research Methods for Globalizing IR. So now this chapter was written as part of an edited volume produced by Leiden University academic staff, edited by Beatrix Campbell from LUCIS, and it discusses how to globalize IR and, importantly, how to include regional voices so that we can move past the ethnocentrism of North American and European scholarship. I don't know if anybody who attended the Amitav Acharya panel last year, where I presented the early foundations of this book chapter. Well, it wasn't last year, good grief, it was 2 years ago, I think, at least. So I was on that panel, and so this is where this came from. So anyway, I will begin. In the course of my daily duties as an academic, I'm often approached by international relations, or IR students, asking me how I learned Arabic during my PhD and what is the best way for them to do the same. More often than not, I find myself simultaneously sympathizing with their plight and then dissuading them from trying to complete a PhD in international relations and learn Arabic at the same time. The discomfort I experience when doing this comes from the hypocrisy of my advice. It's a classic case of do as I say and not as I did. Now, the reason I dissuade students from language learning and deep regional embeddedness as an IR scholar is because I found to my dismay that learning Arabic and building a nuanced, deep knowledge of the Middle East did nothing to improve my job chances in international relations. And in some cases, I believe my regional knowledge has been regarded as a hindrance and not a benefit by potential employers. On more than one occasion in job interviews, my skill set was challenged with the question of whether or not I considered myself a Lebanon specialist only. Furthermore, even when jobs in IR were advertised as specifically seeking Middle East expertise, I found this to be a misnomer. Universities wanted people who had research case studies in the Middle East, not people who actually knew the region and spoke the language. In sum, I can honestly say that I cannot think of one example of when my deep regional knowledge was of benefit to my academic career in IR. The only time it comes in handy currently is when I'm asked to either write for a generalist audience, speak to the media, or teach students. Until now, in these spaces alone has my regional knowledge been considered useful and valued. Now, despite increasing recognition that gender and racial diversity in the field is essential, the methods that students draw upon in their IR training, I contend, are retaining an ethnocentric approach to what we study and discuss in IR. So only by detailing the experiences of states and regions outside of the US and European spheres can we really build an inclusive IR that draws on a global complement of views and recognizes the ethnocentrism inherent in previous theorizing. For example, people like Karen Smith are already doing this, I should note. For example, what assumptions about how the world works characterize Latin American, Indian, or Middle Eastern IR? How useful is our current theorizing on regions to states outside of the global north? The question of how we should incorporate regional knowledge and area studies scholarship into IR remains extremely pertinent. This means finding pathways to the production of knowledge that provides contextual insights and ensuring that those pathways aren't marginalized. It also means embracing the particular and inverting the rationale of the scientific method that eschews detail for generalizing laws, especially laws that may be grounded in European and Western-centric assumptions. Let me just move to the next slide. Okay, so first I just want to clarify my terms in that I refer to area studies scholarship here as scholarship that broadly defines itself as area specialist and often goes by the names of Asian studies, African studies, Latin American studies, etc. I agree with Bazadar and Kolner's definition, who state that area studies is best understood as an overarching term for a family of academic fields and activities joined by a common commitment to intensive language study, in-depth field research, close attention to local histories, viewpoints, materials, and interpretations, the use of interpretivist methods, often grounded theory, and multidisciplinary conversations, often crossing the boundaries of the social sciences and humanities. I do not refer here to comparative politics, which, like IR, is considered a subdiscipline of political science in the US, at least, and which stresses the importance of strong methods to conduct comparative case study research and does not necessarily assume embeddedness in a region. So this group of scholars, I do not believe, would consider themselves area specialists in the way that I refer to the term here. Of note, however, and I'll talk about this later, is that some contributions to the debates between the two fields have elided or conflated comparativism with area studies. Okay, just move to slide 4. So, debates on the rise and fall of area studies have punctuated the field of IR since the end of World War II. Prior to 1945, area specialists were often embedded in colonial states and working for the colonial project. As the Cold War took hold and decolonization occurred, policymakers became aware of the need for knowledge of other regions of the world, and that included knowledge of other languages. Interestingly, the first report on this issue was drafted by 3 Japan area studies scholars for the American Social Science Research Council. It pleaded for an institutionalization of area studies to achieve 3 objectives. First, to extend the relevance of the humanities, including the study of foreign languages, in a rapidly changing world. 2, to link the humanities to the social sciences across a broad range of interdisciplinary endeavors. And 3, to safeguard the American national interest in what was becoming rapidly becoming a global confrontation with communism. International politics and its effects on funding has always played a key role in the increase or decrease of area studies research. As a result of the Cold War in the 1950s, area studies received significant funding from private donors, and centers were established that cut across disciplines in many US universities. And these were funded largely by the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Carnegie Corporation. Now, this trend was followed later in the UK, but much less extravagantly, and there the initiative came from the government. However, just as the Cold War fueled funding, so it was reduced after the end of the Cold War, as policymakers decided there was less need for specialized knowledge of particular regions. At the same time, globalization contributed to a belief that English was now the global lingua franca, and there was no need for the kind of in-depth language training required 50 years ago. Subsequently, of course, the events of 9/11 provided impetus for new calls for the revitalization of regional expertise and language skills in particular. In addition, IR's inability to predict global events, such as the Arab Spring and the end of the Cold War, has continued to reinforce the need for nuanced regional knowledge. Now, aside from funding considerations, the relationship between political science and area studies has been heavily influenced by debates within political science about scientific standards and the production of knowledge. Lucian Pye in 1975 noted that as political science became more concerned about using rigorous scientific methods borrowed from the natural sciences, the more scientists turned to using subjects from their own cultural context because of the ready availability of usable data. So I quote him here. He said, "Proceeding from the assumption of modern social science that human behavior reflects certain universal consistencies, and therefore the same theory should apply to all men, note men, all societies and all economies, some social scientists jump to the convenient conclusion that since all must adhere to the same rules, then any generalization about the immediate can be taken to apply to all." So this legerdemain in logic thus dismissed faster than the academic eye could see the difference between inflated generalizations about Western behavior and universal scientific truth. For example, in the past, a study on American voting behavior would be given a title that suggested a general investigation, whereas a study carried out in an Asian or African country would be almost invariably given a title that would reveal its specific aspects. This has had serious consequences for scholars from the Global South whose focus on their own region risks being shunted aside as a specialized topic, as opposed to reflecting a political science analysis of the international relations or politics that occur in their region. Acharya in 2006 noted that work which has tried to examine a state or region to understand how it functions in and of itself has been described variously as atheoretical, journalistic, and mushy. These authors are faulted, he says, for not knowing statistics, for offering resistance to rigorous methods for evaluating arguments, for not generating scientific knowledge, and for being cameras rather than thinkers. The atheoretical nature of much work in area studies, which prevents comparisons, is considered weak because it's unable to build or test law-like generalizations. So in sum, Pye contends, in part, the division has been one between those who crave knowledge in the form of universal propositions and discount the merit of mere description, and those who revere the unending uniqueness of human experiences and see mainly empty words in abstract formulations. Other criticisms of area studies within IR are questions regarding the objectivity of the findings. My personal experience has been that IR scholars typically view embeddedness or prolonged fieldwork with suspicion. There is a fear that the objective scholar no longer has a clear view of the value of her findings because she has become too close to her subject matter. Other concerns are that without a broader understanding of IR, the in-depth study of one country might lead the scholar to erroneously attribute a process to a single state and overlook the fact that the same process occurs in other states. Objectivity can be compromised in this view by the scholar's relationship with the host government. The scholar may wish to avoid some areas of study or discussion for fear of repression or banishment. Now, we know this issue applies as much to native speakers as it does to foreign researchers these days, and I acknowledge this is a problem in area studies research more broadly. But this has led to a state of flux for many area specialists over their status in academia more broadly. Some revel in their ability to bounce between disciplines because they aren't specifically aligned to one. For others, the lack of a disciplinary home generates feelings of marginalization and being regarded as a second-class academic citizen. The disdain shown by some disciplines towards area studies means debates have at times been acrimonious. But it goes on from both sides. So Chalmers Johnson, for example, in a blistering response to an article on the division between area studies and political science, argued that the author, Robert Bates, viewed area studies and political science scholars in a hierarchy, stating that he said viewed the area specialist as the role of a gold miner digging away at the cliff face of a foreign culture, while the rational choice theorist is the master goldsmith who can turn this raw ore into beautiful beings. Finally, finding a balance between regional or local knowledge and broader IR theory has been made harder by area studies specialists such as Chalmers, who insisted that to break free of their culture, area studies researchers must spend long periods in the country of interest, as well as learning the language and immersing themselves in the culture. So we must be careful that setting up area studies doesn't become a do or die hardcore project whereby anyone who's done less is not worthy, because it's not helpful to area studies case, as it generates this kind of you're in or you're out mentality. And this mindset often places generalists and specialists at loggerheads in reviews, whereby the area specialists will pick apart the empirics of an article or thesis to prove the ignorance of the researcher's regional knowledge as a way of discrediting their argument. And I'm sure we've all had experience of those kind of debates. Let's go to slide 6. Okay. But alternatively, scholars from the humanities have also taken a shot at area studies. They've critiqued it for privileging the state as the unit of analysis. And furthermore, the regionalization of regions themselves have been considered problematic. For example, what are the implications of separating Latin from Central America or the Maghreb region from sub-Saharan Africa? A further criticism launched at regional specialists by humanities scholars in particular has been the colonial and imperialist nature of it. Area studies, after all, was born of empire, and Edward Said's classic text Orientalism launched a post-colonial movement dedicated to ridding area studies of its colonial mentality. This movement raised questions about whether academics from the global north should comment on the regions they studied, and more importantly, critical analysis of how their research reproduced Orientalist discourse and an exceptionalist view of a state or region outside the Occident. Interestingly, I note that research on the EU never seems to have this stigma attached to it within IR. There appear to be no negative connotations when you attach to the Occidental nature of research on Europe, outside of perhaps critical theoretical approaches. In the same vein, Acharya notes how area studies conventions in North America are often heavily attended by humanities scholars who show limited appreciation for regional specialism and regional comparisons, and dislike it when area studies scholars turn to disciplinary theory in relation to security and policy relevant work. So in sum, critiques on the value of a dialogue between area studies and IR political science have come from both sides, from those in area studies and the humanities, as well as from political science/IR. These debates have ultimately served to erode the credibility of area studies scholars in many university departments. Okay. So, further complicating this debate is the emergence of the subfield of comparative politics. Pye notes in the early years post-World War II that in order to compensate for a perceived lack of rigor and disciplinary hone, many scholars migrated from area studies over to comparative politics. They recognized that to survive and publish in international relations, they would need to present as doubly skilled. Regional experts needed to have language skills and local knowledge, as well as rigorous methods. However, comparative politics scholars these days do not necessarily demonstrate deep regional knowledge or language skills, especially outside of the US doctoral system. Furthermore, they too have been accused of favoring middle-range theories, using soft versions of methodologies, having case selection bias, generating and assessing theory from the same data, and harboring a dislike of the isms of IR. So debates on the contribution of area studies to IR often, I found in my research on this topic, conflate area studies and comparative politics, owing to the lack of clarity on its definition. In a series of articles, for example, by Peter Katzenstein, he demonstrates a big optimism about the increase in the number of students studying the regions in US universities, but he fails to recognize that most are actually comparativists with limited in-depth knowledge of one country. This in turn obscures the issue of the persistent use of positivist methodologies by comparativists that can fail to take account of context in many cases, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. So, new approaches to this conundrum. So leaving aside the muddy waters of disaggregating comparative politics from area studies aside for a moment and refocusing on how to incorporate the particular and context into IR to make it truly global, it's worth noting that new attempts have been made more recently to identify new classes of scholarship that may assist in this process. So we go back to Acharya, who divides this new classification. He tries to create a model of how this might work into two main subtypes: disciplinary area studies and transnational area studies. You'll note I've had to put a diagram because there's no way I could talk about this easily with it being clear. So the former category, disciplinary area studies, contains two further subtypes who work on regional issues. So you have regionally oriented disciplinarists who come from a specific discipline and are interested in applying theory to a specific region. and discipline-oriented regionalists who come from the background of a regional interest but apply disciplinary theory in the course of their work. The final cluster are what he calls transnational regionalists, who focus on specific topics relevant to globalization and research that knowledge across multiple regions. So, for example, global health, migration, and so forth. Acharya notes that globalization has made regions more porous, making possible a more issue-based approach to studying international politics that simultaneously illustrates a particular while crossing regional boundaries. Now, although somewhat unwieldy, his categories, or this model, does draw out the differences in scholarly focus while providing scope for future work that is able to draw on the particular as well as the general. However, the emphasis on disciplines and transnationalism in these categories may not help to increase investment in local knowledge and in seeking alternative forms of IR outside standard Western-centric theories, elements of research that many area studies scholars hold dear. Now, a further model that has been advanced is Basildon Kolner. I've said here 2009, it might be 2007, but it's in my book chapter, so that can be clarified. Now, these two scholars have attempted to marry the particular with the general by elucidating three categories of comparative area studies. Their model comprises intra-regional comparison, inter-regional comparison, and cross-regional comparison. So rather than focusing on issue areas or disciplines, this approach focuses on what they term entities. So an intra-regional comparison would compare entities within a region, for example, political parties in Southern Africa. An inter-regional comparison would compare different areas as units or entities, e.g. regional cooperation in Latin America and Africa. And a cross-regional comparison involves comparing different entities across areas, so comparing resource-rich countries in the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. So to the extent this approach synthesizes local, regional, and global differences, it may signify a positive way forward for theorizing and including the particular, especially for scholars who still wish to engage with the IR literature. However, I maintain it, those last two categories, I could see how there might be some confusion as to what they actually mean, but the article itself unpacks that in more detail. Sill in 2009 suggested increasing the number of cross-regional comparisons. So this approach was the idea that you would use collaborations between regional and national experts, so area studies scholars and regional scholars, to develop a more global perspective on IR. So the argument was, if this is done well, this approach would respond to earlier critiques of comparative politics research, particularly from the 1950s and 60s. And those critiques in the 60s and 50s were that comparativists tended to only study Western concepts, such as, for example, the classic modernization theory, and then apply them to regions. So ultimately, then, the suggestion that area studies scholars come together to conduct cross-regional comparisons, yes, that might be useful, but this would need to be done using assumptions that don't automatically take Western conceptions of IR as their starting point. Either way, to achieve this, research that mines local knowledge will need to take more than a case study comparison alone. As noted by Acharya in 2014 and others, to truly tap into alternative conceptions of governance, institutions, and interstate and community relations, international relations will need to draw on the work of area studies scholars who can explicate local concepts. Hence, the Globalizing IR project per se is an opportunity to draw on the embeddedness of area specialists, to help build new theories in IR and further shape our conception of what IR looks like in non-Western states. So a great deal about the contribution and value of area-specific knowledge has rested on the development of ideas about the production of knowledge in IR. I'm now briefly going to discuss positivist research methodology, which arguably these methods dominate IR, and the challenge they pose for students and scholars alike who are interested in local context, irrespective of their disciplinary background. Let me just move to slide 10. Yep. So, okay, for those of you who may be familiar with the television show The Big Bang Theory, Sheldon, a theoretical physicist, is speculating in an episode on how he can win grant money to test his highly abstract theories on what constitutes the universe. He turns to Leonard, his friend, who's an experimental physicist, to ask for suggestions on the experiments he might use to put together a grant proposal that will fund his research. Leonard thinks for a moment and then replies that because Sheldon's ideas are so abstract, he can't think of any way to test them. Sheldon then asks Leonard the logical question of why he keeps his job as an experimental physicist if he can't think of any experiments. Sheldon's point is one that often bothers students. In IR, in particular, they are taught about the different grand theories that purport to explain how the world works. However, when it comes to testing these ideas, students are informed that using the scientific method means finding testable hypotheses that can be falsified. For most grand theory, no such hypothesis is explicit enough to be tested. As a result, students are then encouraged to find or generate middle-range theories that are operationalizable and therefore testable and falsifiable. But I argue that by limiting the production of knowledge to testable and largely observable or implicitly observable variables / causal mechanisms, not the same thing, but I'm just putting them together here, we greatly limit the scope of what is regarded as researchable in IR. And this has direct impact on what we examine, where and how we do that research, and which contributes to the ethnocentric generalization problem I discussed previously. And there's a further problem attached to this. Not only does the scientific method, inverted commas, constrain us as scholars on what is testable and therefore considered researchable, it also excludes pluralist conceptions of the production of knowledge. Patrick Jackson in 2016 noted, oftentimes scholars in IR misconceive methods as a dichotomy, for example, a battle between positivists versus interpretivists. So this leads to what he terms as a dialogue of the deaf. I think it's a great expression, whereby both groups challenge the legitimacy of each other's inquiry without really understanding either's work, and definitely not understanding the scope of what is possible to research in IR, including the subtle differences that emerge between what he determines not to be, in fact, two different approaches, ontological approaches, but four ontological approaches to research. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with The Conduct of Inquiry by Patrick Jackson. And I'd say the most important takeaway from Jackson's critique of methods is that there is a lack of intellectual honesty in the way IR is taught academically. Students are often taught that neopositivism, so-called, that's his term for positivism, is the scientific method, and moreover, the only one that is valid and legitimate. As a lecturer, frankly, I do find this frequently trips students up when trying to develop their own research projects. Many students are drawn to the more critical literature, encompassing, for example, securitization theory, post-structuralism, feminist and post-colonial theories. They then attempt to marry these theories, sometimes at the insistence of their supervisors, with neopositivist methodologies, and more often than not, with fairly disastrous consequences. So what's most unfair, in my view, is that by insisting on the use of neopositivist methods, academics are imposing a philosophical, well, this is Jackson's world, a philosophical ontological hegemony on their students, but without making that explicit. This is in IR. And this has direct consequences on what students study, the theory they preference, and how they research that theory. Arguably, one of the most limiting aspects of neopositivist methods is the sacrifice of empirical detail for method. So cross-case comparisons often use million methods of similarity, most similar case, most different, between variables to justify case selection, possibly triggering methodological selection bias. The point here is that the rich detail found in area studies is often neglected. So even when within-case methods are employed, they're often used to explain a particular theoretical problem, which often suffers from the ethnocentric issue noted above, but often not with the aim of showing how the specific context of the state or region plays out. So rather, once the hypothesis has been identified, the search is on to find evidence of the existence or lack thereof of that hypothesis, not to fully explicate the surrounding context, because causality is not imagined to lie in context itself. So ultimately then, the goal of this kind of research is to make law-like generalizations that fit with IR theory, not to identify the particular characteristics of regions or states. As Sill notes, the very act of treating one's object of empirical analysis as a case and one's observations as data points suggests a commitment to a nomothetic endeavor ultimately geared towards identifying or confirming general laws or law-like regularities. In contrast, area studies research usually requires the use of what we might term more contingent approaches to knowledge and knowledge production, and more inductive research. It often uses methods that require an element of ethnography, appreciation of culture, reflexivity, and the unacknowledged practices that formulate and constitute knowledge within a state or region of interest. All of which is to say, the question here is, how do we reconcile the neopositivist, post-positivist dichotomy and find ways to help build the particular and regional voices into IR research? Compounding the marginalization of the particular in IR is that some academics will go so far as to dissuade their students from embarking on a critical path. Oftentimes, that is because they may not feel comfortable supervising theses that fall outside the range of neopositivist methods, which usually infer causation from covariation and constant conjunction. In part, however, this is also due to a lack of clarity. I think what Jackson says is true on what post-positivist methods are and how they can be deployed. I find that students at master's level in particular often find it hard to identify a suitable research methodology with which to conduct research using critical approaches. And often I think that's because the authors of this literature are not always explicit enough about how they reach their conclusions. And this kind of approach is a term, what I term a you know it when you see it paradigm, which in my view is also deserving of some of the critiques leveled at it. So when we consider then how students can conduct research in the emerging field of globalizing IR and basically incorporate more regional voices into their work, we come across the challenge of methodology as much as we do area studies integration into IR theory. So I don't think we can disaggregate methods from any of this. I think methods is at the heart of the problem. So while area studies is a broad discipline, much of the research is ideographic, empirical, analytic, based on single case studies and ethnographic. This is not to say, however, that the use of ethnography is not a legitimate research method, and nor is it regarded as such in IR. It's not completely abandoned in any way, nor is it to argue that the single case study should be abandoned. For those in IR will know some of the most influential theories in political science on power and policymaking emerged from single case studies. And some of the most interesting research on non-Western political systems have come from interpretive studies. However, this scholarship still remains slightly outside the mainstream of IR. I shouldn't say slightly, quite far outside the mainstream of IR. And what we find, as an interpreter myself in IR, is that you find that when you're undertaking this kind of work, you have to work much harder when publishing to justify the use of alternative methods. So I argue here that first and foremost, it's essential we ensure students receive a holistic view of the methods of knowledge production in IR that is pluralist and makes clear the philosophical ontological assumptions of each approach. This would be an excellent start in helping students find their academic voice. Presenting this information early on will help to avoid a great deal of confusion students can face and hopefully free students up to find alternative methodologies that get at the heart of regional and local knowledge. Second of all, I wish to suggest pathways to knowledge production in globalizing IR that can act as a bridge between political science methods and area studies. In the book chapter, I refer specifically to analyticism. That's a Jackson creation, but it's based on Weberian principles of ideal types. Comparative historical methods is another way, and cross-regional comparisons. Narrative analysis is an emerging, increasing use, certainly in feminist research. Discourse, obviously, in critical discourse analysis, and some intimate interpretivist forms of process tracing also could take a more contextual approach. So in conclusion, the perception that regional knowledge is less valuable because of its particular nature should be of a concern. If we are to understand what international relations looks like in other parts of the world, we need to recognize that positivist epistemologies have had an impact on what we research and what is viewed as valuable. I contend that examining the full range of variation in society, across societies and within societies, and political systems across the globe is as important as generating universal laws. And my final slide, just to say this is who I am, and this is my latest publication, which is not an academic publication. It's a book about how I learned Arabic for a year in Syria. So I'm spruiking it here because I can. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. I want to give the floor actually immediately to the audience, and then I have a couple questions of my own, but maybe we can start with an audience member. So I think maybe what's best is you just raise your hand, and I will call on you. And if not, I will take the opportunity myself. So just let me know if someone had anything to say.
And I apologize. I know there's an awful lot of information in there, but
It was, but a lot to
well, I'll send the book
to pick
chapter,
up on
so that
as
will
well,
make
right?
it a bit
So,
easier, I think, to
yeah.
to digest.
So maybe I can start really quickly. So it seems to me, I come from a background, I guess an area studies background, but I'm a historian. That it's rather than the problem of area studies, it's rather the problem of IR, right? Because there would be long-term commitment if you were an anthropologist or a historian in the region as well. So it seems like in that way, IR is sort of the odd person out, so to speak. Because I think disciplinarily, the commitment to, that is actually often how you are gauged as a researcher. Right? Like how serious is your work? How long did you spend in the field? These are questions that are automatically asked usually for historians and anthropologists, but it seems that that would be a negative in the world of IR. So is that more about IR and less about area studies and the disciplines?
Thanks for the question. And it's great because it is only when I speak to audiences outside of IR that I get these kind of questions, and it reminds me, oh yeah, some people do see value in this. All of which is to say your question hits the nail on the head. It's really something that I've observed because I did a very sort of, I focused on Lebanon. I learned Arabic language. I really, loved dealing with the Middle East. That I realized, and I was told actually by one of my supervisor, that it would do nothing for my career in IR. And it's true. As you've got an emerging body of scholars. I'm working with one at the moment who is from a particular region, Latin America, and who works very hard to understand context prior to doing any kind of sort of cross-case comparisons or any kind of actual real sort of structured comparison or structured field work, right? So he goes in the field first, understands the context, and then, starts to research. Whereas in IR normally, and especially in North American and the sort of formulaic approaches, you do a mixed methods PhD, which will be quantitative and qualitative. You will, if you work outside of the US, I mean, I had IR scholars from the US tell me that because they studied regions other than the US, they were looked down upon by their other IR scholars who said, oh, you're not doing real political science, right? So it's that bad, basically. So all of which is to say, first of all, yes, you're right. I think the problem is in IR. And the reason it's been a problem is for the reasons I said in this lecture. Traditionally, following sort of trying to emulate the natural sciences, I think has led IR down a very dark path that doesn't recognize the innate value in understanding humanity more broadly and understanding local practices. And it's also led to this issue of ethnocentrism in terms of IR being very much a white old man's discipline in terms of the theories that we relate to, in terms of it's very undiverse. It's been criticized. It's working to change that, but it's light years behind, especially in terms of contributions from the global South. And people talk about equalizing that, but then there are problems related to that I can talk about if anybody wants to know. But all of which is to say there's a lack of diversity, a lack of appreciation of nuance, a lack of context. It's all about finding generalizing laws that I think predominantly come from this idea of, well, we need to emulate natural science as much as possible. And what's really interesting as well is that you're seeing developments, for example, in things like experimental research. And a lot of experimentalists think they're doing, really hardcore science. But as another colleague of mine said, actually, the methods that some experimentalists are using now in IR were abandoned by psychologists years ago for being leading and not very effective. So IR, to my mind, is always, running behind to try and prove it's this hardcore science, abandoning context, not taking any real interest in the people of the regions, just wanting to know, okay, can I prove this general, this mechanism is present or absent, therefore X and Y will happen. And it's just a very narrow way of looking at the world.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's a very long answer, but
no. I mean, but these are IR programs that wouldn't be area studies based, like the MAIR program here at our university is a little bit more. I mean, I guess that would be an anomaly for you.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, I'm good friends with a lot of people engaged on that, and I'm very impressed by the fact. I mean, people like Karen Smith are the ones, really pushing this global IR agenda and saying, look, we have to understand local perspectives on how the world works. We can't say, so there are people doing that. But if you go to political science or you go to my faculty, it's not present. It's very old school.
Okay, thank you. Natal, please.
Yes, thank you very much. So I just want to ask you about how you view international relations within humanities. So there are here at Leiden University, there are various programs in international relations, but the one in the humanities campus is explicitly oriented towards presenting a humanities-based IR approach, and I just want to hear your view on that, but also on views on international relations within Leiden University College.
Yeah.
And also if you see a difference also with international studies, the BA program. So I should like to hear how you view these programs and whether you see ways of improving their approaches, also the curriculum.
Look, I'm not engaged with either the Humanities IR program per se or LUC. I have most of my friends, however, teach. The ones that I have the most in common with are the people who teach on those programs. So first of all, I would say that those programs definitely do. I mean, it's as I said, I mean, people like Beatrice, who I, edited the book that this chapter is based on, which is specifically asking, how can we globalize IR? How can we make it less ethnocentric? And Karen Smith also wrote a book with, oh Lord, her name escapes me, just recently, again, also looking at global IR. And then you have people like Marina Kalkali, who are deeply embedded in Lebanon as well. So, but what I would say about those programs is that they're the exception rather than the rule. I have taught now across 3 universities. I have applied for hundreds of jobs as an IR scholar prior to getting this one at Leiden. And very few ever advertise, certainly in the English language speaking world. So we're talking America, Canada, the UK, Australia, New Zealand. Very few were interested in regional specialism. And what you tended to find as well, especially in Australia, which is a much smaller market, you tended to find that if there was one person who did Middle East, that was it. You didn't need anyone else. And they wanted to be the expert on the Middle East, So it could work against you in the sense that there was no sense that you might want to create a critical mass of people who knew a region. You know what I mean? It's like, okay, well, we got someone who does that. So now we need someone who can do, if they're going to have a regional specialism, it should be somewhere else, rather than thinking, okay, maybe these people. I mean, obviously, the Australian National University is different. They have a Middle East Centre, which is very humanities oriented. They teach a little bit of IR, but broadly speaking, they take a Middle Eastern approach. But there's still this, the problem is this fundamental disconnect between mainstream IR theorizing and conceptions of how the rest of the world works outside of the global north. So that's my contention. The BA International Studies, I'm afraid I don't know anything about that. But I certainly do know that at LUC and Humanities that's not the case. But they do seem, in my experience, to be the exception to that rule. A great exception.
So I can clearly recognize this and see the problems also. I know this kind of debates also within sociology. I think that's also the ethnocentric character of sociology that often comes up as well. But if I think of the future careers of international relations students, I often think in terms of diplomats or international organizations. And if you think of them, then it becomes important, I think, for IR programs within specific countries that they somehow have knowledge of specific, of other states. I think that often that's the main thing. So I'm wondering how there is also a disconnect between the future career of students within this field and what is taught within these programs.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent point, because I mean, this is the problem. And I teach on a program that is very practice oriented, and I had to pull back, when I first started teaching, pull back a lot from sort of theory, because the students, a lot of them want to go on to be practitioners, as you say, diplomats or working for NGOs or working as a international policymaker. And you're right. I mean, their global knowledge is more important, because there is also a huge disconnect, and I'm sure you know this, between IR theory and practitioners. I mean, okay, now we have feminist foreign policy emerging. Well, I mean, 20 years ago, or even 5 years ago, if you'd said that, you would have been laughed at. Like, come on, everyone's a realist or a neoliberal, So you also have this kind of, if you go into, you also have a conflict, because if you go into, say, the British Foreign Office, I say that, I guess, because I'm British, or DFAT, the Australian, because I'm also Australian, and you start talking about constructivist perceptions, for example, of the world. People are like, what? Like there's one order, and it's a neoliberal order. And, when it comes to security, we think like realists. And when it comes to economics, we think like neoliberals. And that's it. And so feminist foreign policy has really kind of thrown a spanner in those works. But that's another actual, I think you rightly highlight, an issue, actually, if you want to study IR and you digest, myriad theories, and maybe you write this deeply theoretical piece for your thesis, and then you go to try and get a job at the Foreign Office, and they might, as you rightly say, take someone who actually knows how to speak a foreign language, or who has a deep understanding of a certain region, over and above someone who, understands post-structuralism.
Yeah, so I'm so surprised that this does not bring IR programs to adjust.
Yeah, well, the funny thing is, it's such a popular topic. I mean, it's unlike other areas that have suffered, I think, and have been penalized. I mean, a lot of it, we know it comes down to funding. IR, we just get the numbers. It just gets more and more students every year want to understand about international politics. But I think you're right. I mean, anyone working in IR acknowledges that theory and practice just are two different worlds. Where I work in the space of peacekeeping is probably the closest place where practitioners and theory actually engage. But again, only on certain things. And if you go too far off the neoliberal spectrum, you lose the policymakers, which is also actually, I would criticize the policymakers for that, because I don't think they really respect local knowledge either, a lot of peacekeeping operations. So, I mean, that's both parties.
There it goes wrong.
Other questions?
So, Lynn, I have a question,
yes.
but I can't raise my hand because
that's okay. That's okay, Petra. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for this raising this very interesting topic, of which, of course, we all were slightly, at least, aware of its existence. I was wondering. I'm really curious. Because, well, we have often within our department also the discussion, what about the language teaching? We see a development, well, the same as you also say in international relations. We have a lot of students that want this kind of studies. Within our department, we have we have tracks, and one of the tracks is Modern Middle East, and that means that they have only a limited language knowledge. So what would be your ideal program? And that means that the tracks, the Arabic, Persian, and Turkish track, Hebrew track, are very small. We have, I think, the Arabic track has mostly around 10. Persian and Turkish have about 3 to 5, and Hebrew 1 to 3, but not so much. So what would and we think, at least I think, I speak only for myself, that still knowing language is the port, the door for entering a culture.
100%. I mean, I say this as someone, it took me 7 years, and I'm also, my husband's Syrian, so that helps because he didn't speak English for the first 3 years. So I really honed my skills. But I totally agree. I mean, how you conceive of a concept. I mean, the research I'm trying to do at the moment is exactly examining that in the Middle East around conceptions of how you look at concepts around gender, and language has a huge role to play in that, especially languages like Arabic, where you have the dialect and the fusha, you know, so you have these completely different, you know, the formal language, which has a lot of connotations in certain contexts, and the language that you speak at home and to your friends. And that's just one example. But no, I agree. I mean, language is critical to understanding how people see the world. But unfortunately, especially with, well, certainly Arabic and particularly Hebrew, well, certainly Persian less so, and Turkish. It's, you know, it's really a 2-year full-time commitment unless you're really a whiz-bang pop linguist. And I think a lot of people just don't stay the course, and partly because if you work in, say, the Gulf, a lot of these conversations happen in English at the sort of business and INGO level. Certainly the Gulf. Whereas if you go to other parts like the Maghreb or, you know, the Levant, it's different, and you can't put a price on how valuable it is. So I don't know if students are put off by the fact that it's such a big commitment, especially in terms of Arabic, and the fact that, you know, if you're a native English speaker, at least there's always someone who speaks English, blah, 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 you know, so it makes native English speakers like me incredibly lazy, which was why I wanted to learn a second language. Now learning Dutch slowly. But again, you all speak such good English where I work. It's much harder than if I should be just thrown into a village somewhere and told I can't leave until I can speak Dutch, and then I might master it. But no, I mean, there's no... This is really the problem. I mean, language definitely is the key to understanding how people conceive of and how people talk about something. Gives you an understanding of what they really think about it, right? The words they use, the phrases that they have. I mean, actually looking at Dutch and German, for example, I find them fascinating because they have these wonderful words, very much Teutonic words for a single idea that we would take 5 words to say in English, you know? Really deep, thoughtful stuff. And then it have all these other layers that I won't understand unless I'm, you know, getting into the language. So I agree. But yeah, when I said I was going to the Middle East, it was in 2009 to learn Arabic. My supervisor was like, what are you bothering to do that for?
Oh, yeah, well, that's a pity. Yes. No, I also encounter it with the students who do theses, BA or MA theses, because then they have a great plan and they have a great ideas what they want to research. But if I then ask, and what about your sources? And then, are you able to read Arabic? Are you able to read Turkish? Are you able to read Persian? And then very often they realize at that moment that, well, they only have access to English sources, and that is limited. It's not the whole story. Especially, I'm doing research on Turkish television drama.
Oh yeah, the musalsals, wonderful.
No, that's the Arabic one. In Turkey, it's the dizi, but it's another concept. It's not the Ramadan.
Oh, right. Oh, so it's not the Ramadan ones, right? Okay.
No. And at the moment, Turkish diseases are booming. You can find them everywhere on internet, on Netflix, etc. But that is only a limited number of series, and not all the series are there. And if you really want to understand how a series functions in a Turkish society, you need to be able to know the language. And so I think also that, but how can we make students, the future generation, aware of this?
Do you know, I mean, the experience that I've had with students on the master's program I teach onto, which is the Master of International Relations and Diplomacy, it's a 2-year program, is that there's a great interest, but again, it's not privileged by the program. So, you know, for those that would like to actually learn a second language alongside, which in North America you would be able to do because they do incorporate a lot more. But I think it just comes down to funding most of the time, is that people just, you know, we don't prioritize it in the learning experience. A lot of masters are 1 year because, you know, I mean, this course is a private course and it's 2 years. But I think certainly in Australia and places, it's just funding that the government doesn't want to pay for people to learn languages. So I think if the government could be persuaded to encourage people to do that, we might actually find that students would realize, oh, okay, so, you know, there's the tolerance for that. But if you're told, look, here's all your courses, and yeah, you can learn a language in 1 semester, you know, you're not going to learn anything. You might learn how to order a cup of coffee. You know? I think it's a much bigger question that I'd be very happy to sit down and have a deeper discussion with you about, because I wrote the book, Follow the Arabic Road, like not to indicate just how difficult Arabic is, but also to sort of show the Middle East as a place that's multi-layered and you know, to get away from these awful sort of, you know, very narrow conceptions of what the Middle East is. But again, I got that through going and learning the language. And even now, you know, keeping it up as well, actually, I'm actually back in Arabic classes because my writing and reading skills have gone right down again. And I want to use Arabic language documents.
So before I call on Natal, there was a student, actually, speaking of students, Nuhaila, that wanted to speak. And I just wanted to know if she's still around and if she had a question.
Yeah, I saw her hand. Sorry.
Yeah, Nuhaila, can you come in if you have a question still?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay,
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
For noticing my hand. Yeah, I was kind of hesitant because I have another online event in a couple of minutes, but I do want to raise a short question if possible. And it's actually, I'm pursuing my master's now at Sciences Po, and I did my bachelor's in international studies at Leiden University. And I'm actually having this issue now with my thesis supervisor, in which so we have the possibility to do field research, and I do speak Arabic from my, it's my second language actually. And I'm having this issue in actually making my supervisor understand why I feel like it is very important to do this field research. And it's exactly this debate and this issue what you're talking about. And I was wondering if you have some advice for me, or maybe some readings that I could do into legitimizing my my methodology, basically. Thank you so much in advance.
No, and thank you for asking the question. And first and foremost, I'm really sorry that you're having to have this kind of discussion in the first place. I'm really sorry to hear that, because it's, you know, again, I don't want to help. There are many problems with North American political science, but usually they're pretty good about letting their students go off and actually do in the field research. So hats off to them for doing that. And then, you know, it's not fair on the rest of us if we don't allow our students to do the same. I can certainly send you my book chapter. Let me have a think. Can you send me your email? My email's on the screen. Shoot me an email and I'll see if I can think of some other material. A friend of mine just wrote an article about doing research in East Asia, specifically also addressing this problem, but I haven't had time to read her article yet. I just downloaded it. And I'll see if she's got anything there that helps kind of back up your claim. But unfortunately, if you have a supervisor who is very much an IR sort of, leaning, you should sit in an armchair and theorize, or very sort of, positivist and, well, you should be using samples that are easy and close by, then you've got a challenge. I mean, I don't know how easy it is to change, to find someone who would actually. I mean, I changed PhD supervisors for that exact reason.
Okay, thank you so much, and I will definitely send you an email. I think it would be a bit easier. And I don't know about changing my supervisor. I don't know how this works, but I think it's mostly because Sciences Po is very policy oriented, and my personal opinion is I am very interested in policy, but I also really think that this in-depth knowledge of the region and exactly the culture and the language is very important. So I'm going to try and persuade my supervisor of that and widen the field a little bit.
When you email me, send me your concept for a topic, and I'll see if I can help you shape your arguments in ways that might be more convincing for them that you need to go in. Because, I mean, they are always very cautious. As I said, they're very suspicious of going and doing field work, some of these people, but also it's sometimes just a question of making it very clear why you would need to do that. And sometimes it's just throwing in the right phrase here and there. And then they're like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. What they don't want, basically, first of all, they're always going to worry about your security, especially if you're going to the Middle East. That's always a huge thing. I had huge problems with that. But also, they don't want you going and wafting around. They want to know that your work's going to be very directed and very focused. And I don't know what ethical concerns they have there, but certainly in Australia, it's a real job to get ethical approval as well. So, so when you shoot me an email, just give me, tell me what you've told your supervisor, and then I'll see if I can help. Because, sorry, there's no quick answer to what you're saying, but I'm very happy to help you offline.
Thank you so much. And sadly, I have to go for the other online event, but thank you very much for this lecture and for letting me email you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for coming. Bye. Masaleme.
Thank you. Thanks, Nuhira. I know she's already gone, but I was very helpful sort of to bring it to also a very pragmatic level. Natal? Maybe we'll end with your question.
Yes, perhaps I have a final, very short question. I was just wondering if you could say something about programs in international relations in Syria or in other Arabic countries, whether you think that if you see a different approach here, and also how this relates perhaps an interest from these programs in European approaches, or how does it work, or are there no programs in international relations? Could you tell me something more about that?
Oh, yeah, well, I can give you some idea. Okay, so in Lebanon, so let's start with Syria. In Syria, all the education is in Arabic, everything. Whether it's computer training through, so I couldn't tell you what they study, but obviously it's probably going to be a very specific viewpoint because it's Syria. Now, more broadly, so for example, the American University of Beirut and the American University of Cairo are still ultimately, despite their names, locally owned, but very, very influenced by North America and very connected to North American universities. And I actually had somebody doing one of my PhDs did their master's there. I'm not 100% sure what the curriculum was like. I do know that a friend of mine started to do her PhD there, and it was not a good experience. And she was being asked, actually, the flip of this, she was asked to learn 5 languages while doing a PhD. So they said, oh, you want to study Ottoman history? Well, you're going to need to learn Turkish. You're going to need to learn German. You should probably learn French and Arabic. And, geez, learning one language come on. So, she dropped out. It was just the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. So that was a very bad example. I also know that university, I've worked with them before, but they're not the most organized. So I don't quite understand how that happened. So I don't know much about their master's program. I do know they do run fantastic Arabic programs in the summer that students go to, or used to, until the economic crisis. I don't know about this year.
Yeah.
Now, in the Gulf, so for example, in the Gulf in Qatar, you have these big university city. Yeah, so you have Georgetown, and you'll have UCL and Cornell and all these other, Texas A&M, but Georgetown is the one that teaches foreign policy, but everything's done in English, because basically I was told when I was there that as long as you do, I didn't study there, but I went and did some research there actually early on in my PhD when I thought I was going to do a different topic. And they basically said, as long whatever you say in English is fine, just don't say it in Arabic. So that was how they functioned, and again, very much along North American lines. Then you have the University of Qatar. Again, it's all European, North American staff running them. I'm not entirely sure what their programs are like, but I know with Georgetown it was fascinating. You know, they were living in a sort of semi-dictatorship, or a very comfortable, you know, typical Gulf kind of managed state, but they were learning about democracy and all these. And so the guy who convened the course at the end did actually say, you know, he sort of said, I'm not sure where all this is going, you know. But you had a lot of Lebanese and Syrians going, and Palestinians going over there to do their courses. So I think they've been very influenced by the North American model across the Middle East. And the Brits are trying to get in there, but, you know, the North Americans have got the money.
So no change from that. So that would bring in new perspectives from other places.
No,
it's more of the same.
Yeah, and that's why people like Karen, I keep mentioning her name because she's so invested in this project. People like Dr. Karen Smith in the Department of Institute of History, I think, but you know, she's IR, are so important because they are trying to capture, you know, and Alana O'Malley as well. Now she's, you know, got this Global South engagement with the UN project. So you've got people who are looking at this, but again, it's kind of, you know, it's people in the global north looking at it, and then you get into the whole thing about, you know, the other regions and how to engage them and standards, and there's a lot of challenges there with sort of you know, getting work onto a parallel and who decides what those standards should be, and it starts to get very difficult, but the conversation needs to be had.
Yeah, I think we have actually run out of time.
Sorry,
but thank you.
Very long answers.
No, thank you so much for your enthusiasm, but also your kindness to the student, I think is something that others can also think about. Yeah, that was just very kind. And I hope that others can also take you up on your offer to email you. I'm sure that's also possible. Thank you. And thank you for everyone who attended. Yeah, thanks, Vanessa, for your time.
Thanks so much for inviting me, and thanks for your enthusiasm. I mean, I've had great questions and engagement with this topic. And it's so nice hearing it from not from outside my discipline because you get it.